This is the 12th and final session of our advertising school. I'm sure there will be much, much more to come from our advertising school, more videos, more collaborative stuff. Dan and I are, and the rest of the crew are figuring out what that looks like. Today, we have an awesome digital social thinker, Joseph Day. He also goes by Joe, just so you know. Joe has been at Gray for a really long time. He was at 360i. He's director of digital strategy there. I had the privilege of working with Joe briefly. Actually, this is like a poetic end to our advertising school. Joe, Dan, and I met on the same day. Am I allowed to say who we were brainstorming for, or should we keep that?
I think so, right? Yeah. I mean, it's not like anything came to fruition of it. So
we had a huge brainstorm for Applebee's. It was like, what are we gonna do with Applebee's? But it was an awesome session, and it was a really, like, I think to Jim Wall's point, our first speaker at the beginning of our advertising school, like some of the most interesting creative ideas come from or are meant for those brands that are not like the flashy Nikes, like the sexiest brands in the world. And we came up with awesome ideas that day. Hopefully, in some way, those have stayed alive, even though they didn't necessarily come to fruition.
The spirit of them lives on.
Yeah, the mechanics are still going to be recycled.
True, truly. I mean, hopefully.
Yeah.
So this being kind of the last of our kind of pilot program for our advertising school, we have a survey that's being shared. What we want to do at this point, so you guys have submitted some awesome work over the course of the 12 weeks that we've been doing this. And what we're looking for now at the end, hopefully those assignments have been interesting and useful for you just in stretching your skills, no matter how you've approached this course. If you've followed along and submitted assignments throughout and you have at least 10 of the 12 completed, we will share a tracker for that, for those assignments in the post in our advertising later tonight or tomorrow morning. Make a copy of that and share your tracker with us, share the submissions from each week's assignment. And what we're going to do for everybody who is able to submit at least 10 of 12 of those assignments is we're going to look for, always one straggler. We're going to do our best to get you guys feedback from somebody relevant to your prospective role, the discipline you want to be in. We want to get them to kind of look over the portfolio pieces that you feel really confident in. So include everything in the tracker. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
No, just saying in case you haven't, I think Katarina sent an email about this. A few of you have. If you haven't finished all the assignments, that's cool. Try and do this within the next 2 weeks or so, and send that to us, to our email account. So you've got some time. It doesn't have to be done tomorrow. So let's say maybe like a week after next Monday.
Yeah, so that's 2 weeks from today, which is, probably should have done this before we go. That'll be August 31st. We'll say those are due. And with
and yeah, actually, let us know in your email in this lesson. Let us know who you'd like to chat with. If you could just be like, I'm a copywriter, I want to speak to a creative. I'm a strategist, I'd like to speak to a strategist. Just include a quick note, and we'll be able to connect you with them for a portfolio review.
Yeah. Any other questions on that? Feel free to drop it in the chat. If not, let's go ahead and learn about the world of social and digital. Up last, but certainly not the final consideration of any good campaign, just Day.
All right. Should I share my screen, or how do we go about this?
Yeah, go ahead and share the screen. Should be enabled for you. You have a little green button at the bottom.
All right.
Oh, Grace, what do you got for us?
It's a spreadsheet to connect, like someone suggested.
All right. Can you guys see this hello screen?
Got it.
All right. Hello. Yeah. Hey, guys. Thanks for being here with me. I'm sure that there are other things you could be doing, but you're here with me and Joe and Dan, and I'm stoked about it. I wasn't sure what the name of the actual class was, but basically it's social media creative 101. Using these terms really loosely, I think it's really going to be a mix of social / digital, also a mix of creative / strategy. I'm not really sure who I have on the line here, but hopefully your guys' interests flex across these spectrums. Here's a picture of my fucking face. My name is Joseph Day. I am Associate Director of Social Media at Gray, New York. I consider myself a creative strategist. Sometimes people use me as a strategic creative, for lack of a better term.
We need to do. I feel sorry for you.
What's that?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was unmuted. Sorry.
All good, all good. But feel free to pipe in if you have any questions, comments, criticism throughout. We can keep it a discussion if that's what's better. But these are the things that I am. I have worked on some brands. I'm going to flash a really obnoxious slide really quickly, but I've touched a shit ton of brands. Some work I've done for them I'm super proud of. Some work I'm not that proud of. I won't get too specific, but I've got some experience. I'm also from everywhere. My path to social strategy, social creative hasn't been too linear or too direct. I started at a PR agency called Weber Shandwick, fresh out of college, pretty desperate. I started in account management. Really wasn't my thing. I realized I hate people more than I thought I did, and I shouldn't be that client facing. So I moved to their at that time budding digital department where I just started doing community management for brands. So really low level social media stuff, but that was how I started to get into it and realized that I kind of thought the space was a little bit interesting, at least a lot more interesting than I thought PR was. So I moved to 360i, which had a specialty in digital social creative. And there I was a content manager doing really low level copywriting, art direction, and overall content management for the properties I was working on. And eventually I moved to Gray, which is considered a creative agency. I actually first started there as a strategist and then eventually moved to the creative department, where now I'm doing what I currently do, pretty much setting up social media as a creative product rather than just a strategic discipline. Okay, so that's some shit about me. So you guys are here to, I think, learn about how to make best-in-class social media. This sentence in and of itself can be annoying just because there's so much to unpack in just the few words that this sentence has. First of all, what is social media and how do we define its parameters? What is best in class? It's a term that's kind of thrown around willy-nilly by creatives, by clients, by strategists. So unpacking that a little bit. And also, what does it even mean to make? Because that's all the way from concepting, defending your ideas, and eventually implementing. But hopefully I'm able to start to gesture towards an answer of this question with some 5 chapters. What the fuck is social media? What the fuck is best in class even mean? How can a brand have a point of view on social? How can we find our tone of voice on social? And how can we hone our visual identity on social? So these are the touch points I'm going to go through in this very 101 social media class. Starting with just the basics of all basics. What is social media? At least what do I personally define social media as? And it's a plethora of things. This is kind of like a brain dump of things, no real rhyme or reason or hierarchy to any of these notions, but I can start to touch on them, and hopefully it kind of paints a picture as to how I view social media. So for some reason, there's a bunch of C alliterations in these descriptions, but social media is a lot of connected communities. You have to keep in mind that it's not channels operating in a silo. Channels are influenced by each other. What you see on TikTok, you're going to see on Instagram. What you listen to on Spotify is going to bleed to your stories. Everything is kind of connected in that way. And creation is also not held within a silo. It's important that you consider how to create with culture, how to create with influencers, and not just slap hashtag sponsored or hashtag ad on another piece of content. Content is king, obviously, on social media. Content as commerce. It's its own sort of economy, and the more content you have, the better content you have out there, the more likely you are to have a pretty effective social media presence for a brand. Starting to get into a little bit more theory, social media is always on in a way that I think other disciplines of marketing tend not to be. So in a way that you can only see a TV spot when it happens to be getting served to you, when you happen to be watching that channel or that show. A brand's social media channel is always on, it's ever present. That brand's Instagram channel is always living there. And that brings you to the next point, which is it is destination oriented. People can choose to visit that brand's social media presence whenever they want to. In a world where nobody's going to skittles.com to understand, is this brand right for me? Does this brand get who I am? They're going to go to Skittles social channels. So there's a notion of destination oriented lens to social media. Another big differentiator for me in social media versus other pieces of the marketing mix is it's engagement based. When I worked in PR, I really realized pretty quickly that it's very impression oriented, in the same way that out of home billboards are really about how many people are you reaching, how many impressions are you garnering. In fact, I had one conversation where they were talking about some event that they threw in Madison Square Park, and I was saying, like, okay, so you just want me to report on impressions for this event? And they're like, yeah. It was like something like 500,000 impressions because 500,000 people walked through that event. And I was kind of pulling on it a little bit and saying, like, but 499,000 people out of those 500,000 people could have thought that event was shit. And they're like, we don't care about that stuff. We just care about the impression. So I started to get a little bit curious as to how can you dimensionalize what you're putting out there in a way that can be data driven, can be a little bit more informed, and care a little bit more about what people thought about your piece of content, and a little bit less about just how many fucking mass numbers you're reaching. Also important to understand that social media is one slice of a digital presence. There's also e-com, there's banners, there's search, there's all these other things that are part of your digital presence. Social media is just a small part of that. And this digital and social is one sliver of your overall marketing mix, on the same line as TV is, as out of home is, as print is. It's another spoke in the wheel. So just some important things to consider in terms of a definition of what social media technically is, because it's not just Facebook, right? It's also cool to note that there are apparently only 3 types of social media content out there. This is actually a framework provided by Facebook, so it's Bible, but it sometimes helps us apply a little bit of rhyme and reason as to how to approach social media content, noting that there are technically only 3 types out there. It's good for a brand to have a healthy mix of all these 3, and they don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. But starting with immediate content is that on the go, smack you in the fucking face, quick get really snackable content. It's your static images, it's your short form videos, it's your GIFs, it's your cinemagraphs, it's a text only tweet. This is an example of an immediate piece of content from Garnier, for example. It holds your hair perfectly, and it's just a picture of a woman upside down. So quick, immediate get, immediate piece of content. This piece of content from Vix, I think, is cool. It's still immediate, but love how they actually affect the text to actually illustrate the product benefit there. So pretty elegant, but still a very immediate piece of communication. Could you guys hear the sound on that, by the way, out of curiosity? Outside of
we did.
Cool. Moving into interactive. Interactive is a little bit more involved. It's what you would call lean-in content. Can sometimes be categorized as dialogue-driven. It's a lot more active. It's a lot less passive. Examples of interactive content on social media are, your classic Instagram or Facebook carousel, where you're literally interacting with the unit, swiping through the frames, and dialoguing with in that sense. Or it could be, a poll on Twitter or on Instagram stories, or it could be even the gamification of an RTB. These are all interactive notions of content. I just pulled, an old example, but one of my favorite examples from a brand, this zoom in on the syrup tweet from Denny's, which I would categorize as interactive. When you do zoom in on the syrup using the pinch to zoom feature of Twitter, you can see it says, look at the lower left corner. Then it will go take you to this, now look at the lower right corner. Now look at the upper left corner. Now look at the butter. And then the joke lands right here as, has this distracted you from overwhelming existential dread, LOL. Just cool that this piece isn't just a static image. It actually used the pinch to zoom feature to turn it into something that's a little bit more interactive, right? A little bit more lean in, a little bit more involved. this last piece of content type here, immersive. This is sometimes what creatives tend to get a lot more excited about, because it tends to venture into more traditional forms of storytelling, tends to be more longer form. I think examples, content type examples for immersive content could be something that's longer than a 60-second, for example, boasts that immersive experience. I think even a 360-degree experience on social or digital is that. And sometimes even those long form live things that you tune into can be pretty immersive. A cool example of an immersive piece of content is like what New York Public Library did, where they actually translated some famous books into Instagram story highlights, where you could literally tap through each of the pages of the book, and they're evergreen living as a highlight. So a really elegant digital translation of something that's otherwise physical, and a cool example because it's actually melding immersive with interactive. So just showing that these three pillars of content don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. I'm going to play an ad for you guys from Valentino. Sometimes I love to look to the fashion industry for just what is sort of breaking boundaries or thinking through things a little bit differently. This is a little bit more of a traditional piece of film content on social, but you can see it's 100% made for social. You'll note that it's very vertically driven. It's made perfect for that mobile real estate, where they're actually re-envisioning their clothes to be vertically exaggerated. So I'll just play this for you guys for a second.
If I walk out the door, it sounds lost goodbye. If you don't pull me back, it wakes 1,000 times. If I walk out the door, it sounds lost goodbye. If you don't pull me back, it wakes 1,000 times.
Yeah, so that's all I'll play from that, but it's a 4-minute piece, and it's fucking sick. It's FKA Twigs, as Joffrey you called out, and just cool to see them, literally reimagining a product for the vertical space and clearly creating this immersive, almost hypnotic experience with their content there. So that was just some 101 on what I think social media is and some what social media content can be. But let's just unpack this term called best in class, which I'm fucking sure, Joe, you've come across before. Dan, you've definitely heard this before, but best in class is a term that's really thrown around by clients, by creatives, by strategists, and it's a pretty relative term. So it's a loaded term, but I think it still does have 3 important lenses to consider, even though there's no silver bullet answer as to what best in class social creative is. Firstly, it's decisive. Always it's decisive. When a brand knows who they are so much so and what they stand for, that they sound and look so definitive that it allows them to be nimble and purposeful with everything they do. It allows them to be quick, reactive to culture, reactive to people, just because they're decided about who they are, what they stand for, how they sound like, what they look like, all those good things. Decisive is super important. It allows them to also be ownable, right? Which is also really important for a best-in-class brand. So not only should they be offering really differentiated, fresh content that adds value to one's feed, but it also should be uniquely correct or almost believable coming from that brand, to the point that it's memorable and owned by that brand. And then lastly, behavioral. I think that great social media content and great brands on social media don't just operate at a post level. They're not just concerned with how do I tweet, how do I post on Instagram, but they're able to understand how to behave on these channels and how to interact with, once again, people and culture and move it past the sum of its parts. Cool. So that was what social media, what do we mean by best in class, and now how can we start to make good social media? And firstly, how can a brand even attempt to have a point of view on social media? Before we to get into it too much, I wanted to show you guys that a point of view of a brand is really part of a larger strategic brand hierarchy, right? It's living within these other principles. Starting with a brand archetype, which is usually a pretty general understanding of what that brand is meant to be doing or servicing into the world. The social archetype is usually a more specific version of what that brand's archetype is, and gets a little bit more definitive, a little bit more directional, a little bit more directional and actionable. Some brands even get to personify this archetype into a muse, a person who actually can bring that archetype to life in a way that is once again extremely definitive. And this brings you down to your tone of voice, which is of course derived from your archetype and your muse, as well as your visual identity. And then you get eventually into your really nitty gritty, which is more for a strategist, but your channel presence. How do you take all these principles and start to infuse them in the channels, use the channels uniquely, but all in service of this larger strategic or brand hierarchy? I threw out that term archetype, and it's also a loaded term here, but an archetype is pretty helpful because it can help you hone a point of view as a brand. A lot of times clients are really looking for their brand to be everything, say everything, and kind of cater to everyone all at the same time, but that's just not going to fly on social or any other marketing channel for that matter. So it's important to be disciplined about that and try to hone one simple point of view on the world. And it's nice that there are apparently only 12 archetypes of human storytelling. And this isn't meant to be rigid. It's actually just meant to apply some rhyme and reason to the guardrails that we clearly need to be enforced, right? Just some brand examples I want to call out here because they show how certain brands can start to be, remembered for how they hone and own a particular point of view of storytelling. So Olive Garden, when you're here, your family, they're clearly all about, that caregiver attitude. Skittles, the jester. Somebody once told me that they're high most of their life, but they've actually never been Skittles copywriter high. So Skittles really is meant to infuse some sort of silliness or comic relief to the world and how they view culture, versus someone like an Applebee's, which is arguably the citizen or the everyman. Eating good in the neighborhood is all about that notion of belonging, and so they're all about that. How can we relate to others? One brand I do want to double click into, just because I think it is best in class.
Hey Joe, before you and maybe you answered this already, but there's a good question here that it might be worth kind of addressing.
Totally.
Do brands pivot between these places, and how hard is that?
Across the segments of these 12 archetypes, you mean?
Yeah.
So no, I think is probably a pretty simple answer. I think a disciplined brand really shouldn't be pivoting across multiple points of view on the world. But what they can do is hone a specific point of view in the world, and maybe infuse something smaller from another one. And for example, you could be, let's say you wanted to be a provider or a caregiver because you're a medication, but you don't want to just be a straight-laced caregiver. Maybe you want to inject some cheekiness into it. So you can borrow properties from the jester and inject it into your point of view on the world as the caregiver. And then all of a sudden now you're the cheeky caregiver or the cheeky provider, So you should hone a point of view on the world, but you can borrow from others to inject into that priority point of view.
Totally.
So hopefully Wendy starts to dimensionalize that a little bit, because it is a really good question from Kevin. Thanks, man. Wendy's really has this fucking figured out, and I had the luxury of peeking under their hood at one point in time in my career. Wendy's, they stand for fresh, never frozen, right? That's what their reason to believe is. In a category where meat tends to be frozen, they stand for freshness. Even little things like they have square patties instead of round patties. They really are that sort of challenger brand within their category. So their brand archetype that they've clearly chosen is the rebel, is the challenger. And so when they choose to dimensionalize this into social, they've turned it into, or they've taken the liberty of making it the challenger with charm. So injecting this notion of charm into the point of view of the rebel, to ensure that when they are challenging, when they are rebelling against category conventions, they do it in a way that elicits a wink, a smile with their tongue pressed firmly in their cheeks. So not just any challenger, not just a bully, but a challenger that does it with charm. And they were able to even specify a muse, which is apparently Chris Pratt in Guardians of the Galaxy. The agency that does Wendy's social stuff actually has cardboard cutouts of Chris Pratt in all of their conference rooms to make sure that as they're concepting, as they're writing for Wendy's, they're always vetting against, would Chris Pratt and Guardians of the Galaxy say this? If yes, then maybe let's try it out, right? And this even drills all the way down to something as gritty as your tone of voice and your visual identity. You can see here on the examples on the right that even their tone of voice and their vis ID is still fresh, right in line with what their reason to believe is of fresh, never frozen. So out here trying to melt these frozen fools, you can almost hear Chris Pratt in Guardians of the Galaxy saying something like that. Also, when somebody like Louis says, Wendy's roast me, and Wendy says, get one of your 51 followers to roast you, you can see that they're even being fresh with their audience. And I think that that's really clever. And their Viz ID, right? It's also fresh, right? Pretty airy, light, fresh, approachable, modern. So it's cool that they have such linearity across their thinking, which gives them a lot of justification to not just operate at the post level, like I mentioned, but at a behavioral level. So all of this ends up manifesting in how they chose to attack Fortnite, for example, where they actually just decided to create a character and destroy all the freezers that were holding frozen meat in the game. So you can see that their challenger with charm, that their rebellious archetype comes to life, not just at a post level, but like I said, at a behavioral level, when everything is, all their ducks are in a row and everything makes sense. So that was Wendy's. And then we're just going to drill down even further into past the theory and a little bit more into practice. So if anybody's a copywriter, this is probably, where you'd be paying attention a little bit more. But how does one even decide for a tone of voice on social media, and how can you begin to approach that? I think that there could be 3 steps to deciding your tone of voice on social. Noting that, of course, it can get messy. There's a shit ton of cooks in the kitchen when it comes to putting guardrails around your tone of voice on social media for a brand. It's never just going to be your social strategist just laying down the law. It's never just going to be the copywriter. It's never just going to be the VP of the account. It's all those people meeting nonstop for 3 months and multiple check-ins with client. So it is helpful to have some semblance of governance around how you want to approach this exercise. But start with inherit. Think about what you can actually pull from what's existing from the brand in terms of tonal cues, right? What historical work do they have out there that they have thought has been effective, communicative, and what can you borrow or learn from that tone of voice? What's currently out in market that you can see is doing well, and what can you borrow or learn from that tone of voice? So start with what you want to inherit, what you want to pull from, and then eventually figure out how you want to translate that into the channel of social, into the digital mindset, knowing that social is a little bit more about brevity, knowing that people's attention spans are a little bit shorter, knowing that people are whatever. How can you translate a lot of times those traditional notions of tone of voice, which are usually manifesting in a TVC or sometimes in a print ad, and put them into a social media context? So that's translate. And then lastly, refine, understanding that you need to kind of continue to evolve and optimize this tone of voice based on what you're seeing. So as I mentioned, social media has the luxury of being informed by data. If you put a piece of content out there that's really long-winded, kind of this legato run-on sentence that you were trying to be funny, and it performs piss poor, versus something that was a little bit more staccato, quick hit, one punch piece of copy, you can maybe start to learn, hey, our quick-witted, hard-hitting copy is doing a little better than those run-on sentences. So just showing that you can refine and optimize your tone of voice principles based on what you're seeing from the data that you're pulling. I'm also going to show you some cliche trope continuums that allow any creative or any strategist to start to become a little bit more decisive about where you want to plop your brand on these spectrums here. So a spectrum of antagonizing all the way on the left to really super sweet and saccharine of a brand, and somewhere approachable in the middle. I would put Wendy's on the left of this continuum. If you were Wendy's, this is what you would define your brand as on this continuum. But let's say you're someone like a Glossier with this tweet that's like digitally picked for you, and it's just a picture of a flower. They're clearly a lot sweeter with their audience. I actually kind of like that Glossier post for some reason, but just showing that two brands manifesting themselves completely differently on this one spectrum of tonality. Just some other tropes I want to throw at you. A spectrum of playful to provocative, with cheeky maybe being a sweet spot in the middle. Straight direct versus irreverent and esoteric, with this notion of neutral and informative maybe being right there in the middle. Some other dualities to consider as you're thinking of your tone of voice on social: how you treat the product versus how you treat the brand. When you're trying to sell something in particular versus maybe entertain your audience, your tone of voice needs to flex slightly. Once again, when you're entertaining versus maybe educating, having fun with your audience versus trying to really explain what the product benefits are, your tone of voice needs to, once again, flex across this duality. But also responding to people versus culture. When somebody on community management has a very specific question as to why they broke out in a rash when they tried on your makeup, the way that you respond to that person is very different than responding to a tentpole in culture, like how you operate during Thanksgiving or the Super Bowl. So just acknowledging that your tone of voice has to flex across all these dualities, but still have guardrails and principles applied to it in order for you guys to be as directional and actionable as you need to be. It's like there's a question here. Do some archetypes work better on some channels than others? Seems like challenger brands like Wendy's wouldn't do as well on IG as on Twitter. So I think it's an interesting question. What I will say is that when your brand needs to come to life, both tonally and visually, I will say that some brands naturally lend itself to those sort of parallel path manifestations. Twitter is a lot about words. It's the only channel where you can kind of pretty much just post words if that's what you want to do. So that's where a brand that has a really strong tone of voice tends to kick ass, like a Wendy's, for example, right? But other brands that tend to be a little bit more visually driven are going to really celebrate themselves pretty well on Instagram, like fashion brands, etc. But I wouldn't say that an archetype tends to lend itself to a specific channel or not. I would say that there are some archetypes that are inherently a little bit more exciting than others. So for example, like Skittles being the jester, it automatically lends themselves to having a lot more fun on Twitter, on Instagram as that jester, versus an archetype like the everyman, where you just aim to provide empathy and acknowledgement and understanding to people. That just naturally lends itself to being a little bit more blasé and a little bit more run-of-the-mill. So sometimes brands like pharma brands tend to be the everyman that just want to communicate at a very direct level. So I guess I'm answering your question in multiple ways, but I wouldn't say the archetype is going to lend itself particularly to a channel, as much as tonality will and visual identity should. Some other things to consider, I'll just throw at you for tone of voice, because they do actually contribute and add value to your tone of voice. Are you the type of brand that uses emojis? Make that sort of decision. Are you the type of brand that uses exclamation marks, has 3 of them next to each other, or are you a little bit more tempered and tend to use periods or whatever? Even hashtags. Sometimes hashtags, when you tack them on at the end of a piece of copy, can sometimes come across as thirsty, maybe a little bit young. Hashtags also contribute to your tone of voice as well. And I just want to close tone of voice with a best-in-class example, which I think Denny's really just has their tone of voice just really figured out, to the point that if you look at this screenshot on the right, they're able to turn it into kind of a stream of consciousness rant almost. That's how decisive they are about their tone of voice. So just reading some of these: French toast like normal toast, but with more tongue. We'd love to hop on this trend, but strategy department says boomers eat a lot of breakfast. So really irreverent, really colloquial and conversational, the way that these tweets are manifesting. Like I said, there's something almost stream of consciousness about this shit. Like when you even look at the dates attached to each of these tweets, 3/11, 3/9, 3/8, 3/6, 3/5, they're tweeting these pretty often, almost once a day. So there's this almost always on stream of consciousness to it. Sometimes they're borderline esoteric, like fork in French is fourchette, but fork in mouth is pancake. Like, it's funny because you can barely understand what they're fucking talking about, but I think that's the sort of esotericism that they're trying to have.
Moon pie is really good too.
Dude, Moon Pie kicks ass. I also think Slim Jim is fucking awesome.
I think Moon Pie like kind of came out of nowhere. I feel like
dude,
in the last few years, and like their social following is just. I don't even know if it's that big, but like they built a brand out of tweets, like just straight up.
But I think that's a thing, right? Like Old Spice came out of nowhere back in the day because P&G was like, we don't care about that brand. It's not doing that well. Go have fun. And I feel like that's probably the conversation that was happening in Wendy's and Denny's and like a lot of in Moon Pie.
Yeah, it's, and you know, to Olivia's point here that no brands really do super well on Twitter, big name brands. It's so true. I would say it's the channel that every brand I tend to work on is really having trouble with. They, for some reason, can't really figure out how to use it uniquely. And I think that when you consider the fact that Twitter was really born and bred from just 140 characters and it's really headline oriented, how can you bring your brand to life tonally? And I think brands that sometimes do text only tweets and can do text only tweets well are brands that are showing that they know how to use the platform.
I think it's like teams that are smaller and leaner with less hierarchies and like trial by committee. I mean, that's why like getting a tweet approved on a big brand, it's like you'll run it. I mean, Joseph and I worked on Super Bowl, you know, for Pringles, and like you'd have like a whole war room of people, but like steps of approval, and that was on like the quickest day of the year, right? So everything, and even then, there's 5 or 6 people that have to yes or no something. So these small brands, the Moon Pie, it's like just a guy, and they were just like, here, took the keys. It's a really good example of how, like, if you're working in an ad agency, if you're a strategist or you're a writer and art director and you get responsibility over like something that most people don't want to do, you can create some really great work out of it.
Yeah. There's an Instagram question here, and I'll talk about Instagram when I flip to the next section, which is visual identity, which, you know, we know manifests a little bit better on Instagram, or at least that's what the channel is really made for, or how it's consumed. So that was, how do you decide on your tone of voice and some things to consider and think about. So this is the same thing, but for visual identity and how you use images. It's the exact same fucking process for tone of voice. Think about what you can inherit from the brand. What visual language, what visual world do they have out in market? Do they have historically out there that you want to borrow from and bleed into social? How can you translate those visual principles into a mobile, vertical driven world? And then of course refine it, knowing that you can use data and analytics to inform your visual identity. And then once again, throwing some continuum tropes at you, some cliches as to how to put guardrails around your visual identity. Dark and moody versus bright and vivid. I think this is fun just because it's difficult to even imagine a brand being dark and moody, but believe it or not, a lot of brands are. If you look in fast casual dining, like TGI Fridays, Applebee's, for some reason, they always have these like darker wood grains and these sort of like moodier worlds that they're living in, versus fast food like Wendy's, which is a little bit more bright, vivid, probably because they want to get you in and out of there. But just cool to see in a similar category, the completely opposite sides of this visual spectrum. Slice of life versus conceptual imagery. So Buffalo Wild Wings here on the left, where they take an actual, you know, moment in time, just a real dude eating a real burger here. Nothing too conceptual about it. It's pretty straightforward. All the way on the right side here, you got a fucking chicken tender on the side of the street from Denny's. So just showing that slice of life can be a lot more straight versus conceptual, a little bit more imaginative, but definitely 2 very different visual identities for 2 very different brands. Some other continuums you can explore: flat versus graphic, flat and graphic, a little bit more modern, versus photographic. Some brands are a little bit more lean on stock photography a lot. Sometimes brands choose to be a little bit more staged. Some brands choose to be a little bit more candid. So some questions you can ask yourself are, how do you want to show product? I work on a brand called Frank's, and the way that they choose to show product is actually pretty interesting, in the sense that they never ever want the bottle to be closed with the cap on. The cap is always off. It's always like sort of pouring on food. It's always like in the middle of being used, and that gives the product some sense of like, it's almost kinetic. It has some sort of energy to it. It's never too static and stoic. So just how you shoot a product can actually be pretty evocative and communicative. Once again, how do you want to show people? How do you sell versus entertain? How do you use supers? I think is really important in terms of your visual identity, knowing that social media is a very sound off platform. So how can you use type? How can you use text overlays to really convey your points, knowing that oftentimes people don't have their sound on? What fonts do you use? What's your primary, secondary, tertiary? Same thing with color palette. All these rules have to be pretty much set in stone if you want to be decisive, ownable, and eventually behavioral on social. So I pulled a brand that's maybe not as expected because it's in fashion, but there was a point in time when YSL had a really interesting visual identity, and I just wanted to show you guys how strange and sometimes compelling a visual identity can be. It feels very premium. That should say modern, not modern. It's slightly avant-garde just because it's so free-form to the point that the images are bleeding across the grid. It's not operating within one post. The whole story is organic across the entire grid. So I found that to be kind of a strange but modern case of a memorable visual identity. There's a shit ton of other brands out there. Like, I really think Denny's has an interesting visual identity when you look at how conceptual they are. I think International House of Pancakes just did something really cool where their grid is actually just one long stack of pancakes. So just a really cool conceptual way to use their grid. So there's a lot of best-in-class examples for VizID. I have not seen Nugs IG, but I'll check it out.
It's a lot of memes.
Oh, word. So evaluating your VizID and tone of voice, just to kind of wrap it up a little bit, considering how effective you want your visual and tonal presence to be, these are just some 3 checkpoints that you want to make sure you're covering off of: stopping power, staying power, and God forbid, sharing power. Make sure that your shit's stopping people in its tracks, knowing how fast people are scrolling through their feeds. Make sure that it boasts staying power, considering how short people's attention spans are and how much you're competing with. Your piece of content is competing with a baby piece of content, a dog piece of content. So if it boasts that staying power, that's more time spent with your content, that's more time spent with your brand. It can be a pretty powerful lens. And then finally, sharing power. Is your content compelling enough for someone to actually put their name on it, in the sense that they actually bleed it onto their own personal channel, regramming it, sharing it on their stories, stopping power, staying power, sharing power. So I rifled through a shit ton of social media creative / strategy across these 5 sort of touch points, if you will. I would say that if I were to give you guys 5 key takeaways across those 5 chapters, one would be that social media is very fluid, wild, and evolving. Fluid in the sense that, of course, these channels aren't operating in a silo and they're informing each other. Wild in the sense that it is still a little bit of a wild west, where you're still getting things recently becoming illegal, things that weren't illegal back in the day. Just 2 years ago, for example, what you can sponsor, what you can't sponsor, how transparent you are about that sponsorship. It can be a little bit of the Wild West and is starting to get a little bit more governance, but it's also ever evolving, right? The way that the channels operate, the way that your audiences behave, even the things that your brand are looking for and trying to accomplish, all that stuff is evolving. So it's important to have your finger on the pulse. Be decisive, ownable, eventually behavioral. Think past a post level. I think this is what best-in-class brands are doing. Hone a human point of view on the world. If you can be really definitive as to what your purpose in this world is and how you see that world, it'll help you be once again really decisive, ownable, and eventually behavioral if you can be really selective about that point of view. Be discerning with how you use words, what your tone of voice is. Make sure that your tone of voice is memorable. Make sure that your visuals are also memorable as well. So that's what I got for you guys.
That was pretty incredible, man. That was super insightful. Would you unshare your screen and then we'll go do some Q&A stuff?
Totally.
As someone with a Carl Jung tattoo, I love that you used archetypes in there, man. That's awesome.
Oh, fuck yeah. Cool.
Okay, Kevin, you had a great question up here, and I'm happy to repeat it unless you would like to pop on camera and ask it yourself.
Sure, I'll ask it. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool, good stuff, man. Thanks for that. I really enjoyed a lot of those slides with the graphs and stuff. I thought some good stuff there. But so when you take a brand like Wendy's and you take a brand like Denny's, you know, like for the newer brands, I get it. You pick a line and try to hold it. But these are companies that have been around for a long time, and at some point they did make a choice to jump, right? And so at that point, like, how long does it take before people forget or they've moved on? Or maybe they started, like maybe Denny started on Twitter with that line, but some haven't, right?
Yeah. So are you asking, you know, can you kind of flip flop across the archetype wheel, and how long should you give a point of view before you decide to switch?
Yeah, and I'm not saying you can't give it like a year and then switch, because you should make a decisive decision and then hold it. But at some point, right, like some of those brands did make a pretty big flop, right, or turn. And then how long does it take until, like, as a, you know, being in that social space, do you say, well, you got to let it go now for
maybe
X amount of time before it tractions again?
Maybe some good territory to explore here might be like brands that went through really drastic like rebrands through social. I'm trying to think of like because that's kind of where you're thinking, right, Kevin? Where like a brand has started here, it's got legacy, and then it like social media hits, and now it needs to kind of like make a pivot to stay relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the older age of the spectrum, but I would have never saw Wendy's coming out of the gate with that, like, you know, when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me try to answer your question. I think that brands historically tend to have a very broad general archetype. They usually just try to pick one point of view in the world, whether they know it's their point of view on the world. It is their point of view on the world. Whether they've actually applied theory to it and actually said, this is the slice of the pie that we're owning, they do own something in the world. So for example, like an REI, they may have not gone through the exercise of what is your archetype in the world, but they are the explorer. They are meant to kind of push the boundaries of life and experience and be on the forefront of adventure. And how they choose to hone that explorer archetype can sometimes become a little bit more dimensionalized on social. I think another example I want to give you is Tums. Strangely, I've been working on Tums recently, and they are a 100-year-old brand which has always just stood for nothing other than it's a medicine in your cabinet that provides relief for your heartburn. And so when I went through this exercise with Tums, they were able to tell me, hey, we are the provider. We're the caregiver. That's what we're meant to be. All we do is solve problems. When you need us, we provide that help you need for your heartburn. We're just a caregiver. But when applying the social archetype exercise to them, it really helps ask the question, what kind of caregiver do you want to be? And how can we use social in a way that is now always on, and you don't need to spend millions of dollars developing your point of view? You can do it in a tweet. You can do it in a post. Let's apply some rigor to start to explore what kind of caregiver, what kind of provider do you want to be? And we actually landed on the cheeky provider in a way that doesn't just provide the solution to things, but does it in a way that is kind of has some sort of bite or unexpected rug pull to it. So just adding that upfront dimensionality that we were able to do through social of cheekiness added to what their brand story of provider is, it did help them modernize their brand. And how long we're going to be playing in that cheeky provider space is TBD. But I think that's one example of how that can start to evolve, where a brand has historically been into a place that starts to get a little bit more actionable for social.
I like that a lot. I think that's so spot on, that often the client will give you a sense of like where on the wheel they sit.
Yeah,
Getting
this is
into
what
that.
our product does, you know, something really basic, broad like that. But in terms of how do you speak to the world every single day, you need to get a little bit more, I think, specific.
Yeah, totally. Joffrey, I'm going to unmute you.
Cool. Thank you. Super great talk, man.
Thanks, dude.
So like the traditional, like in my agency, like how we have measured the success of social has been like pretty traditional. It's like reach and engagement pretty much. But I know with like more advanced ways of like measuring social, like social listening and like these like very complicated programs, you can measure other things that I'm trying to learn about. They seem kind of nebulous, things like audience sentiment. I'm wondering like what other types of data are people now able to pull to help inform, you know, what kind of content they're making. Like, can you talk a little bit more about that kind of data?
Totally, dude. So when it comes to measuring success of social, I think it's important for one to be objective driven and to consider what is the objective of the brand, and therefore what are the KPIs or success metrics that are only attributed to that objective. So for example, let's say it's a completely new product out in the world, and therefore your objective is awareness. There are only certain metrics that I would say would show that you're being successful in terms of garnering said objective, garnering said awareness, right? Those metrics probably being reach, impressions, frequency, how many fucking people are seeing that there's a new product in the world, hey, it's new, hey, it's new, hey, it's new. How generating awareness with a new product, right? Another example though, let's say your objective is consideration. So for example, Applebee's, no awareness problem for Applebee's. Applebee's, everybody fucking knows Applebee's. What they might be struggling with is a perception problem, or a why should I choose Applebee's over a Chili's or over a TGI Fridays. So their objective in that sense is probably more consideration, right? And I think that those are completely different metrics now. It's like now I care about time spent with my content. If I can make a piece of content that asks somebody to spend a lot of time with it, that's time spent considering my brand, time spent considering why it's better, why it's different. And that's also time spent not with other brands as well, right? So time spent can be a great metric of driving consideration. Engagements can also indicate consideration as well. If I'm actually hitting like on a post, I'm very likely considering that brand is for me. On the bottom end of the funnel, right? You've got conversion, which is a little bit easier to measure because then it's just like straight click-through rates, how many people actually converted. I think it gets a little bit tricky when you start to measure brand love and things like affinity, like you were mentioning, like sentiment. And a lot of times, like that's really just down and dirty comments analysis. You got to get a community manager in there in the weeds, just reading a shit ton of comments and then having them do a report and saying like, hey, this shit is fucking 90% negative sentiment. We've got piss poor brand health. We need to address that. So I think it's acknowledging what your single-minded objective is, and then identifying the KPIs or the metrics that you want to measure that ladder up to that single-minded objective.
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Totally, of course.
To reach something that's more like consideration, like do you ever find that you have to take like a two-faced approach where like first you have to create awareness around a new message, and you just get people like warmed up on that message, and then you do something that's more long form or immersive, and then see if that actually worked by seeing if you can get people to spend more time with that content? Like, is that
Absolutely,
kind of
dude. That's a totally fair strategy, right? Especially if you have the luxury of retargeting budget in your spend. If you can hit them with very immediate, quick get content that just gets them subconsciously aware that, hey, there's a new product out there, and then retarget them with something that's a little bit more consideration later, where now that they are aware, whether consciously or subconsciously, that this product is out there, maybe they're slightly curious, hit them with a piece of consideration content, hit them with a carousel after they've seen that short form video, right? And now you're asking them to spend time considering it, knowing that you've already hit them with the awareness content. So I think that there can be a retargeting strategy to drive them down that funnel and kind of make it a little bit of a linear storytelling approach. but that's if and where the budget approves that, right?
Right. Cool. Thank you.
Totally, dude. Thanks for the questions, man.
I think that's all great insight. Like one like just platform side consideration that I might add in there. The social networks want you to be able to report good engagement metrics.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes to a fault. Like Facebook has inflated its engagement rate to an astronomical degree and includes things like video auto playing in feed as an engagement metric. And often platforms, they don't display this in like the nice like client facing dashboards when you go into like the metrics, but you can download that shit. And I think that is where you really get to to Joe's point, like if you care about reach, and your media budget isn't as big as you want it to be, you only are going to care about engagements that help you drive incremental earned reach. And that's stuff like sharing, number one, commenting, probably number two, and liking as a tertiary. So you might create like for teams in the past, I've created kind of like a weighted engagement scale that tells us like, hey, this is the post that's getting the most sharing if we care about reach. So let's pick out learnings from there and like optimize towards that like metric within a metric.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, man, dude, Facebook drives me nuts. Like, don't get me started on Facebook. Let's see. There's a question in here. Oh, let's see. Is there a resource database you recommend to see some of the latest creative work seeing in social, or do you recommend Googling brands that are making noise in social and taking it from there? Yeah. Do you have like a good repository of like where you look for inspiration?
This is a great question. So great that I don't have a good answer for it. I really have, and if somebody has a silver bullet answer as to how they keep up with best in class social brands, like feel free.
I have a good answer for this.
Thanks, Dan.
Find the work that you like. Find out the creative directors that are doing them, and then follow them in LinkedIn. These creative directors love to share work that they find that's great, and that's where I find work first, always, from the people I respect and then the work they like. So that's like, it has to go through like the daisy chain of like Adweek to LinkedIn in this. But obviously there's like Ad Age, there's Adweek, there's Creativity Online, there's Little Black Book. There's a million ad publications that everyone knows about it. But I found a lot of work, especially from work that came out of Europe, that like I wouldn't have seen otherwise by just following creative directors I respect.
Yeah, I'll throw out some other names out there. Like PSFK has a bunch of shit. The Verge, TechCrunch. I also follow like subreddits like r/advertising, which can help you just keep your foot on the pulse. A little plug in there. Even Fishbowl has some interesting bowls for just social media, especially if it's cool because you can get kind of like people's takes on great ads, on shit ads. I think that they're maybe not a correct answer, but it's a plethora of answers that hopefully get you there.
I also really love looking at r/fellow kids. They're often like negative reactions, but sometimes fellow kids raises up the champions too. You see a lot of Wendy's reflected in there. I like finding those places where it's like, it's social media work, but it's how humans look at it. I feel like the advertiser perspective is valuable too, but it's like, how did the humans out there think about it?
Yeah.
Our like.
Exactly. I also hate to be that guy, but if you just go to YouTube and you type in Cannes Lion case studies, 2019, 2018, 2017, 2016, and it'll serve you playlists where you can spend fucking hours just like leaning back and consuming all of these badass case studies. A lot of them obviously aren't social and digital, but a lot of them actually are. So
totally. Brandon, I'm going to unmute you for your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
We hear you.
Oh, perfect. So during your chat, you mentioned how you got some insight into how Wendy's does their social media, and you brought up that example of the Chris Pratt from Guardians of the Galaxy and that cardboard cutout thing. I was curious, in your workplace prior to COVID and work from home, did you have your own like cardboard cutout of somebody for your clients and their brand?
No, I've never had that, and I aim to eventually get to that place. But no, I haven't. I think it's a good thing to have, because helps you kind of stay true to your tone of voice. I think it also helps clients vet the work as well. If the client could have the same cardboard cutout in their fucking office as you do in your office, and then you're just kind of like operating on the same wavelength that way. I've personally never had that in my office. I wish I did though.
Right. Yeah, I just love that example because it reminded me of like how when I used to work on KFC, we had the KFC RoboCop statue in the building.
Hell yeah. It gives you like a North Star, right?
Right.
Yeah.
At
Awesome.
Reddit, one of our strategists absolutely hated Will I Am. So when he was on vacation for a week, we got him a Will I Am cutout, and that is still in the Reddit office today.
Actually, when we had Papa John's at Gray, there were a bunch of Papa John cutouts, but I think that was a little bit more irony than it was.
Ugh. Joffrey asked another good question. I don't know why you're going and type now, Joffrey.
I'll ask it.
Yeah, there it is.
Thanks.
Yeah, like, do you think, I mean, how do you know if a client should try a new platform? Because I think there's a lot of pressure to be like the first, but it's probably not right for every brand. So like right now, I know Triller is one that people are saying you should, jump on because of what's happening with TikTok. And then I was thinking, are metrics a good reason to try out a different brand from like an agency point of view? Like if a certain platform has better metrics. So I'm just asking generally, like what platforms have the best or most accurate metrics?
All right. So it's a two-part question kind of, right? Yeah. So what gets a brand to explore new channels? I think that there are creative rationale as to why you want to explore a new channel, as there is strategic rationale as to why you would want to explore a new channel. So starting with strategic, let's say your audience happens to be drifting over or spending a lot more time on a given platform. So for example, Twitch. COVID-19, gaming is up more than ever. And so a brand, it might behoove them to explore Twitch, knowing that that behavior that is practiced by their audience is increasing. And so it would behoove them to explore reaching that channel. Another strategic rationale as to why you'd want to explore a channel is the notion of a non-duplicative audience. Reddit actually does a kick-ass job at explaining that a huge percentage of people who are on Reddit are not on any other social media platform whatsoever. So all of the marketing dollars that brand is spending on Facebook, the Instagrams of the world, they're not reaching the people who are on Reddit. So a non-duplicated audience, I think, is a really awesome strategic rationale as to why to explore a new channel. From a creative perspective, though, sometimes there's a new creative territory, a new creative platform that the brand is wanting to approach to reinvigorate the brand or reposition its identity. And let's say a certain channel is simply able to do that better than another channel. Let's say they really want to reinvigorate their brand with Generation Z, then TikTok is obviously going to be the place to reinvigorate their brand to do that, just because of the creative opportunities that it lends itself to. So I think that there's strategic rationale in terms of where your audience is living, but then there's also creative rationale in terms of where your creative platform can best be brought to life. And in terms of metrics, full transparency, the left side of my brain isn't as good as the right side of my brain. So it's maybe not a strong answer here, but I would say that that YouTube actually has some of the best fucking metrics out there. When you are putting a piece of content out there that is obviously going to be a video, you can see shit like the drop-off rate. So literally, as you're talking to your audience, like, and I tell a joke at 3 minutes and 9 seconds, and I see a drop-off rate right there, I can tell, oh shit, my audience doesn't like that type of humor. They didn't like that joke. And so just that one data point that YouTube allows for already tells me so much more than what Instagram can tell me, what Facebook can tell me. So there's all these platforms have their own, to your point, right? Their own allowance of what data they allow you to have insight into. That one particular point of data from YouTube, though, I hold really darling. I think it's really, really cool to see at what point in your video do you start to see drop off, because it helps you pivot, right?
Right. Thank you.
there's this awful entanglement of those two ideas too, which is like, it's like the Facebook owned platforms and Google owned platforms will have the best metrics. They're just going to have the most robust, most built out metrics. And those are also the super saturated platforms.
Yeah.
Like the new emerging cool platforms are the ones where there aren't as many advertisers. And so they haven't built out their ads metrics yet. So there's this constant like kind of like negotiation happening between those things.
It's a dance.
Yeah. Did you have something else, Joffrey? I saw you pointing.
Oh, I was just saying word up. That's true. But I do have another question, but I'll wait for Kathleen to ask her question and then I'll go.
Kathleen, do you want to,
I was actually just one-upping to the question right before, just to have an add-on. So I'll have that person ask first.
Oh, I see. How do you think brands should be called out, or how should brands approach being called out for controversy? It's question number one.
Okay. It's a tough question. When you're getting called out for controversy, I think that you're already in fucking hot water. So if you're a human being, the right thing to do as a human being would to own up to it. I think is what I see good brands doing is owning up to whatever the controversy is, acknowledging that they were in the wrong, and then outlining the steps that they're taking to right said wrong. I know Vogue was taking a lot of steps acknowledging that they haven't been really inclusive with their communications. So Vogue taking steps to change what they're doing. And even little things like brands taking too long to say that Black Lives Matter. Like a brand that takes too long needs to own up to the fact that they took a little bit of time to say that. And sometimes brands will literally say like, hey, it took us a while to say this, but we were just looking for the right way to say it, knowing that it's important that we say it in the first place. So I think approaching it from a human perspective and what a human should be doing is probably the right way to think about it. So own your controversy, be transparent about your controversy, and clearly be transparent about the steps you're immediately actionably taking to right said wrongs, right? I think is how I would approach that.
I think that's super solid advice. And I think often brands are too apologetic in social media. Like often there's this demeanor of like any negative feedback on any piece of creative becomes this like, we're so sorry, we'll remove it, we'll take it down, or like, you know what, it's like, and this is a place where Wendy's, I think, gets it so right, is like, they will jab back. If it's a benign, silly thing. Like there was I wrote about this in my book because I thought it was so funny. It was like, this guy says, hey, Wendy's, I will buy the entire menu if you respond to my tweet. And Wendy says, prove it. And then the guy responds back with like a trash bag and he says, here, I bought it. And Wendy's replies back like, thanks for sharing your baby pictures. It's just like,
didn't Vita Coco sent someone said sent a note on social to Vita Coco that said your product smells like piss or something, and then their social media manager like took a picture of herself with like a big jar of piss.
Yeah.
You remember this?
Yes. Oh, that was so good. That's so weird. Okay.
I think Ben & Jerry's does this the best. If I were to throw a best-in-class brand at, taking a stance, they're not necessarily owning controversy just because they've never ever done anything wrong as a brand. They just fucking kick ass like through and through. But when some brands were struggling to even say like, "Hey, we stand with Black Lives Matter," Ben & Jerry's just went out there just saying "fuck systemic oppression." Like they're just so definitive about their stance, which I think that the younger generation is really looking for. They're looking for purpose-driven brands, and if you can be outright quick and decisive about the purpose that you want to ladder up to and actually act against it, that's going to be a good brand. Not just talking about shit, but actually putting money where their mouth is.
That's actually a really great segue into Kathleen's question. Kathleen, do you want to respond, given that we've talked about this a little bit? And
yeah, sure. That's a perfect answer, because that's actually exactly kind of what I was going for, was especially for that Blackout Tuesday moment where everyone was posting the black picture or we stand against racism. It felt very maybe like jumping on the bandwagon. So how do you establish your brand to get to a place where it seems authentic and it's not just responding to a social moment?
Totally. I mean, the word you use is case in point, right? Bandwagon. Are you just jumping on a bandwagon, or do you actually believe that Black Lives Matter and you action against it in how your brand operates, and even, you know, who's sitting at the C-suite level of your brand? So if you post a blackout picture on Blackout Tuesday, but your whole C-suite is just a bunch of white people, that's just jumping on the bandwagon, and you really need to reconsider what you're putting out there and how you're showing up. Other brands that have recognized that they can't just post that black square, and they need to actually take action and change things structurally in how they operate as a brand and as a company. They didn't just post a black square. They come out with an actual statement that says, hey, we acknowledge that we're part of the wrong here, and these are the 10 or 5 or 7 steps that we're taking to right said wrong. So I think just keeping in mind that word that you had, bandwagon, and asking that brand asking themselves, are we just jumping on this bandwagon, or are we actually, is our C-suite comprised of people of color? Do we actually contribute to people of color's causes? I think a pretty classic example of this is when Gay Pride Month rolls around every year, right? Like, so many brands will post like some sort of rainbow or something like that, even though they historically have never done anything for that community. So they have to once again ask themselves, are we just jumping on some sort of rainbow bandwagon, or is this something that is actually part of who we are and what we stand for? If it's just a bandwagon, then fucking don't do it, and start to consider how you can put your money where your mouth is and actually act in accordance with it. So I think those are just some things to consider.
This, like, I don't think there's like ever a super clear right answer to this, but I want to challenge you a little bit, Joe, because, like, you know, I agree with what you're saying. I am a little bit skeptical of like brands holding genuine beliefs, because brands are part of marketing organizations that are tasked with selling and bottom lines. On one hand, you know, you said if a brand was too late to Black Lives Matter, then that was almost an apology point. But that if a brand is, you know, if that is not within a brand's DNA, is that social issue within, I don't know, like pick an outdoor gear brand's DNA. If it's not at all attached to who they've been previously, you know, is there, you know, do we feel like there is a requirement for a brand to make a statement about it? Or is that a moment that is probably left best kind of silent on the brand's behalf?
Yeah, I think an interesting brand to consider is Volvo here. Volvo didn't actually say anything. Volvo is a Swedish brand, so they're kind of naturally neutral and never really have an opinion. So when Volvo didn't say anything, for some reason, nobody really called them out, just because, to your point, I guess it's part of their DNA not to have an opinion. But to push on that a little bit, I would say it's wrong for brands to have DNA that is unopinionated in this day and age where we need to no longer be neutral. We need to be charged. We need to have a purpose that we're driving towards. And I think brands making the money that they do and putting so much content out to the world that's screaming at people every single day of their lives, taking a sliver of that money, taking a sliver of that stage, and contributing to something that requires that money or requires some of that stage, I think is a responsibility that brands need to start to adopt and negate whatever they think is part of their neutral DNA and start to evolve with the times.
That's interesting. I think the purpose-driven brand is, like, you know, at the very heart of what you're saying, and I totally agree with you that it is like we are going to see a big shift in the brands that succeed in like general popular culture, and it's going to be those brands who are purpose-driven, who like walk the walk as much as they talk the talk.
Exactly, dude.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm like dominating this like these questions for you guys. You guys all have great questions in here. Alex asks, how do you implement things like archetype, muses, and TOV?
Tone of voice.
Tone of voice to newer and smaller brands.
Yeah, totally, Alex. So, so firstly, man, I think it really starts with defending the need to actually be that rigorous and be that disciplined. If you've ever gotten briefs from your smaller brand that says, "Hey, what should we do about this?" or "How should we respond to this?" It begs the question: who are we, first of all? What is our point of view on the world? How do we act? And if all those things were set in stone, the way that you answer that question from the client can be a lot more nimble, can be a lot more decisive. So if you're able to defend the need for those philosophies and principles to be codified, it'll help the client understand that you're going to be even more nimble and even more quick to answer the things that they want you to be doing. So I think it really starts with defending the need for the rigor of archetype, muses, tone of voice, visual identity, defending the need to the client and proposing the value that it gives to them, to do the homework and the exploration around those things. But then when you implement it, I think it's best to not just have those exercises live in a very sort of ethereal, theoretical world. Say, this is who our archetype is. This is what our social archetype is and how we're adding tension and dimension to it. This is who we think a muse could be. This is what our tone of voice is and our visual identity. And here are a shit ton of examples across all of our channels, from product to brand love, that just show how it flexes, how it comes to life. Because I think to implement it, the brand and your client is going to have to see that it lives past just a theory level and can be put into practice. So if you can actually get a copywriter to start to write tweets in that tone of voice so that your brand can start to get excited about it, to start to make posts in that visual identity so that they can start to see, oh shit, that has a lot more popping power, that has a lot more staying power. I get why we need that new visual identity. I get why we need this new tone of voice. Just putting it into practice can sometimes help. Putting pen to paper can sometimes help implement it, I would think.
Definitely. Yeah. And especially like if you're talking like a really small brand who isn't sophisticated about marketing, it's like these conversations are probably too heady unless you can really elegantly bring that. Cause I mean, everything that Joe's saying is like, it's like, this is what the best in class brands and oh man, I said the words.
I know, right? It's so loaded.
But this really is like how the absolute top tier brands are thinking about it, where there are huge marketing machines behind everything that's going on. So there are tons of people invested in these decisions.
Yeah, and whether or not they see themselves as a quote unquote best in class brand or not, they definitely aspire to be eventually. And so if you can simply just justify the fact that these best in class brands have these principles set in stone, and the first step for us is to start to get there too. It's not going to happen overnight, and you need a little bit of patience with it. Sometimes it even helps to bring the client into the workshops. Don't just show them, this is our this is like the one silver bullet right answer. Start to show them, here are 3 different social archetypes that we were playing around with, and they all add value to the brand in 3 different ways. Here are even 3 different muses that bring that archetype to life in 3 different ways, and how it manifests tonally differently. So you can sometimes bring them into the workshop so they feel like they're brought along in the journey, and it wasn't just this dictatorial prescriptive choice that you made for them. But it's part of this creative journey that they're along the ride with.
Totally. Let's see. I don't know who was first. Brandon, I'll unmute you. Olivia, come on. I know you got a mic. You gotta unmute after this. All right, Brandon, you're up.
So my question is about brand archetypes, but like, have you ever observed the instance where a brand and its archetype might change with like a change in leadership? For example, some people believe that Apple changed when Steve Jobs passed. I was curious if you had any takes on that.
So I would argue that just because they changed leadership didn't mean that they changed their point of view on the world. I think that Apple has always been the creator, the innovator, and that's what they look to provide to the world. That's their point of view on the world. How they approach innovation and how they approach being the creator and honing that point of view might slightly wiggle based on who your leadership is, but the brand's point of view, that product's point of view, tends to stay the same. They might flirt with different dimensionalities of that point of view. Like, let's say they wanted to go from the heroic innovator to the everyman innovator, going from something that's a little bit more sleek and shiny to something that's a little bit more relatable and understanding. I can see slight shifts like that in terms of how they're bringing that point of view of the innovator, of the creator to life differently, but their core point of view is still the same.
Got you. Thank you.
Totally.
Okay, Olivia, I don't see your hand up, so I will go ahead and read.
Can I read? I'll do.
Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go.
didn't-
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to go back to Kathleen's comment about like brands being ingenuine when it comes to speaking out about, like, for example, Blackout Tuesday. I wanted to know your advice on like what your stance of the matter is. If you're running social and you kind of notice that the brand is being ingenuine and kind of just covering their ass when it comes to these like issues, how do you like kind of speak out without, you know, getting fired by the end of the day?
Word, yeah. Wouldn't want you to get fired. I think it really is going to start with, for lack of better terms, giving them perspective and making them a little bit more realistic as to what they're putting out into the world. And usually that starts with examples. So you can do a quick little Google search and find like brands that got in trouble for taking a false stance on Black Lives Matter, and literally just create a little deck that says, here are 5 examples of how to do it wrong, 5 examples of how to do it right. And if they're smart clients, they're going to see, hey, shit, I see what the repercussions are of doing this wrong based on this brand, and that brand. And I want to move us over to these latter 5 examples of how brands have done it right. So just grounding it in real examples of brands that have actually faced repercussions from it can sometimes get them out of their own head, get them out of their own product, get them out of their own purview, and understand that it's not just a piece of content that's going to go quietly into the world.
Great, thank you.
Totally.
I like maybe Joe, you've had a much smoother career this way than I have, but I like, for me, there are lots of decisions that I witnessed as a junior employee that I was like, that is the wrong way to do that. And like, I always feel like it's my due diligence to raise it. And if something is like so far against my personal code of ethics that I like can't do it, then it's like, of course, like walk away from the situation. But, marketing teams are teams, like they're collaborative. You're not often the one that gets like solely make the decision, even when you're the head of marketing. So, I love the idea of like grounding in examples, doing your absolute due diligence to show, hey, look, here's genuinely what's best for the business. I do think there's a point where winning the battle will cost you more than it will gain you personally.
Yeah. I would also say that sometimes it's easier. It's easy to kind of just wag your finger at the client and say, no fucking way is that going to work. Like, you're coming across so disingenuous, so inauthentic. It's best to pair that with a solution, with a way forward. So instead of just going to them with, here's what I think the problem is, or here's why I think you're doing it wrong, go to them with something that also helps solve that problem. Once again, grounded in examples. So I would also give that advice of not just coming to them with problems or finger wagging, but also solutions,
But also some finger wagging.
Yeah, a little bit, always. They deserve it. They fucking deserve it.
Brandon, do you have another one?
No, I don't, but thanks.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because you had your hand. Okay. All right. I think unless there are any last minute curveballs, Joe, that was awesome, man. I think those are so many good examples. I love the Jungian archetypes. I mean, personally love that, but I think the way that you framed it is so useful. And that's such a great way to like approach these kind of often ambiguous kind of conversations about like, what do we do in social? How do we sound? What do we act like? I think that's a really wonderful. Alex wants to know, how do I become an influencer? Very, very funny.
Yeah.
Joe,
if you can figure it out for me, tell me as well.
Joe, do you have an assignment for the group?
I do.
I think we
yeah.
briefly discussed it, right?
Oh yeah,
I do. Let me quickly share my screen one more time. Can you guys see this?
Got it.
Here, this is what I consider to be the homework. I figured choose any brand. It could be, a brand that you love. It could be a brand that you hate. Theorize their social presence, giving using the tools that I've given you. You can choose all of them. You can choose some of them. Figure out what their archetype is. Figure out what their point of view on the world is. Figure out maybe a point of view that they should have, and then manifest it creatively. Come up with a creative idea that is drafted off of that theory. So, of course, there's a bunch of quotation marks around all these things of what you want to define as a brand. It could be something small. It can be something big. It can be a personal project or whatever. But I think just to keep things simple, any brand out there whatsoever, apply some theory to their social presence, a little bit of strategy, and then land it in a creative example that illustrates that theory.
This is going to be a good one. I'm excited about this. I would also keep in mind Jim's advice. Again, I'm invoking a lot of Jim this class, but that often the most exciting examples in your portfolio are the contender brands, the unexpected brands, and not the Nikes of the world. So I would encourage you to think in that vein.
Dude, that's such a good point. There are a lot of unexpected brands that can lend itself to a really cool way to approach this exercise. There are also a lot of cool brands out there that have yet to really approach digital and social, that have a badass TV presence, and you have so much stuff to be inspired by and to pull from in order to translate it into digital and social. I think one cool brand, for example, just to throw an idea out there, is Levi's. I fucking love what Levi's stands for as an Americana revolutionary brand, but I've never seen them do anything interesting digital or socially. So how can you take the cool creative world that they've brought to life on TV and bleed it into a non-traditional place? So I think that's just one example I think could be fertile.
Yeah, I would love to see some work around that. Cool. All right. Well, thank you again, Joe. This has been incredible. And guys, final class today. Man, my heart's breaking a little bit. Thank you all for joining and for being part of this. It's been really awesome.
Thank you, guys. This has been awesome. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Dan.
We'll keep it going.
Thank you. And Neha and Edward sadly couldn't be here, but they send their regards. They've been swamped with work, but this has been really cool. I think this has been super satisfying to connect with all of you.
Thanks, guys. I'm honored to be the swan song here. Appreciate it all.
Cool. All right.
Bye, everybody.
See ya. Bye.